I'm so pleased to introduce the next panel. I don't quite know everyone on the panel as well as I know Kollin Min from the Gates Foundation. He is the original, the OG supporter of this work. And last year, he was supposed to be on our foundation panel and got sick at the last minute and couldn't join us from Seattle. We're so pleased that he is in good health this May. But Kollin truly has really just been very vocal about how important it is to do this kind of cross-sector work, specifically in the Pacific Northwest, but supporting that work nationally as well. And we're just immensely grateful for all he's done to promote that. So joining Kollin, we also have David Fukuzawa from the Kresge Foundation and Susan Thomas from the Melville Charitable Trust. I'm very excited about this conversation. They're going to be touching on the theme of today, the equity, as well as discussing long-term goals of their foundations, but foundations generally, in terms of how they're thinking about how to fund cross-sector initiatives. We will leave some time for Q&A, but they'll be having a conversation among the three of them, and we're very excited to have you all here.
Great, thank you, everyone. So the wooden chairs have been brought to the stage. This is a symbol of how informal this session is going to be. When the wood chairs come out, you know that it's a relaxed environment. You know, it's Friday afternoon. It's the last session of a 2-day conference. It's sunny outside, and so you all are really the hardcore to stick through the last. Someone said to me just as we were coming up, you know, so are you ready to dazzle us? And I said, you know, at this point in the conference, dazzle isn't the right word. Keep awake is something that we'll settle for. So by show of hands, how many people were here 5 years ago for the first conference that focused on housing and education? All right, so not too many, and I think that that's a great sign. The people who are raising their hands are really the true OGs in all of this. And some of you, well, I guess only the folks whose hands have been raised will remember that one of the ways that we started the very first day of the conference 5 years ago was to play the dating game. And so by that, we had a panel, and we had Stephen Norman and Michael Mira, I remember distinctly, from the housing sector, with 2 superintendents from their local schools. And we set it up, they didn't know this, but I had set it up as that this was going to be the dating game. And so what I asked them to do was to stare deeply into each other's eyes and to tell the audience what brought them together. It was a very tender moment. I might not do that today if we had the opportunity, but I reflected on that because I thought that it really was a great way of showing the way that relationships get started. And in a lot of ways, all of the work that we're doing, the cross-sector partnerships that we're discussing, it's really based first on those personal relationships that you can develop, and then hopefully they build into institutional relationships. But I think one of the things that we recognized at the very beginning when we were seeding this work is how much those personal relationships mattered. And you know, I was just really struck, Sonia and I were just discussing as I was thinking about 5 years ago, the work and the way that this movement has built. I think a lot of that has really been based upon the relationships that have been formed. And I think it's really a testament to the work that CLAFA has done to continue to foster these relationships through these conferences and through the other forms of information sharing that they've managed. And you know, I just want to give a particular shout out to Abra, because one of the things that's remarkable from my perspective is, you know, 5 years in to any initiative, frequently you'll see a lot of changes in the personnel that have been leading these efforts. And I really think it's a testament to Sonia and to Abra, the fact that they are still here 5 years later and that they're managing to kind of continue to do the work with the effectiveness that they have. So I want to give a round of applause to CLAFA for all of their work. So with that, I thought that 5 years later it would be ripe to continue to build on the dating game theme. And so my colleagues on the panel don't know this.
No, we
I haven't briefed them on this part. But I started thinking about what is the role of funders in all of this work. If we had 5 years ago a panel of the folks who actually were dating, I started thinking, well, maybe funders, maybe we can think about ourselves as the matchmakers, the Tinder, of trying to create cross-sector relationships. So I'm not going to have them stare deeply into each other's eyes, but I am going to ask them to reflect on why they started thinking about themselves as matchmakers in this space, because it's not an obvious proposition necessarily. So I thought that it would be interesting to get started by asking them to reflect on their role as matchmakers in encouraging housing partners to get involved with other sectors, and to really answer, why did your foundation decide to get into the matchmaking business? Why are housing partnerships important and worthy of your support? So let's start with David.
Okay, so I'm so happy to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't be here yesterday, and congratulations to CLAFA in really advancing this discussion very broadly across not just health and education, but a number of different sectors. So I think that's an interesting question, because part of it started with our own kind of early dating experience, which goes back 11 years ago. And just to give you kind of a very, very broad background, in case you don't know Kresge. Kresge is actually one of the kind of original, they're kind of an OG foundation back in the 1920s. So kind of the classic period of American philanthropy. And for most of the 20th century, what we did was kind of fund buildings, like colleges and hospitals and things like that. And about 12, 11 years ago, with new leadership, Kresge began this whole new era, and I was kind of part of trying to create that. And to make a long story short, so I took over the health program, and given that we're an urban opportunity foundation, which literally is about working cross-sector anyway. What does a health program within that kind of foundation look like? And asking some people, what could we do quickly in this sort of area? And the one thing that kind of popped up very early on was lead. Talking about 11 years ago, and lead and asthma and things like that, which have been discussed here in other conferences. And at that point, and at that time, there were really hardly anybody doing this kind of work at a philanthropic level. The only funders in this area were really public funders, like HUD and EPA and CDC. So we started going and trying to get other funders interested in this work. So it was really trying to get funders to see housing as a social determinant of health. And I would say 10 years ago, that was not where funders were in terms of health equity and social determinants. They were thinking about healthy eating, active living primarily. That was the big conversation. So they were looking at things like food deserts and public transportation, things like that. So to even talk about housing as a social determinant was kind of like a new thing. But kind of what happened, then was as we got into this was a realization that the whole issue around substandard housing was actually related to a lot of other things. And the longer we got into it, there was a realization that there was a systemic problem about just the affordability and availability of housing for people. And then to go back to funders and say, you really have to think of housing not as just a one social determinant. It is a threshold social determinant. And it's a pitch I make to funders all the time, that when you think about housing, think of it as really a threshold, because without that, how are we going to get to the other things? And I'm talking about health funders primarily. So I've been in a kind of a rapid dating, mode for quite a while, trying to get other funders sort of, interested in this. But then kind of getting the health players involved in this has also been a whole other dimension of this. And we'll probably, I don't want to spend it too much of the time, but I think, like sometimes what interests two people is realizing you have common interests. And the one thing we began to see is not only in the substandard housing issue, which gets into issues around childhood asthma, but especially on like high-cost patients, in which case, having some kind of supportive housing becomes a big deal. And so Kim Dempsey wanted me to bring up our impact investing side. And we began to realize that there was an opportunity in this space, to think of pay for success or pay performance kinds of investments in this area around permanent supportive housing, which got us also into sort of that end of the pool. And then this whole revelation began to open up to us that this is really, really a much bigger thing than just simply one set of things. There's something fundamentally wrong, about the way we do housing in this country. And now what we're moving towards is really the issue around stability itself as a public health issue, which gets into whole new sets of partners and connects to the folks worried about displacement and gentrification. So I'll keep it at that, just as an intro.
Yeah. Susan, how did you get into the matchmaking business?
So the Melville Charitable Trust focuses on preventing and ending homelessness. And we know and we believe, lots of smart people have told us, and there's lots of evidence that says that housing ends homelessness. And so I know that doesn't seem like a big aha, really? But yes, it does. And a lot of people, though, unfortunately, do not and historically have not responded that way in addressing the issue of homelessness. And so I loved Kamara's, I'm going to steal shamelessly from you. It's so funny, I just have to digress for a second, but I know Kamara from years ago from my time in Atlanta, and we belonged to the same organization. You know how you know someone, but you don't really, know what they, deeply about what they do. And Kamara was always the one to hold us accountable in our group to do what we said that we were going to do. But I never knew you were such a badass. You are, but anyway, I just had to say that. But so that was in a good way, yes. But the visual, and you said it so well, is that when people fall off the cliff, they're falling into homelessness, and that's exactly right. And at the bottom, there are all these ambulances, and the homeless sector was created. I mean, we created a bunch of ambulances to respond to these crises of people falling off the cliff. But, the ambulances don't always take the people to where they really can thrive and where they can go. And someone said to me years ago, and I want to do a little experiment here, close your eyes for a second. And if that feels weird, you don't have to do that. And picture someone who is homeless. Now picture someone who has lost their home. And you don't have to admit it, but my guess is that your visions were a little bit different. I'll confess that when someone asked me that question years ago, my visions of the two people were very different. And that is our implicit bias based on the environment that we live in and work in. And we respond and create systems based on those biases. And so as you can imagine, the little ambulances down at the bottom waiting to take these people, some were taking them to not shelter or a temporary shelter, but to shelter as their new home. And there were all these hoops that they had to jump through to prove that they really wanted to be in a home, which is just really kind of crazy if you think about it. And so we've created a whole sector around this crisis response. And the trust has really operated within our sector. And we needed to create a response to the crisis. But we also need to think about a little bit upstream and what's happening, pushing that population back, up towards the beginning. And that is exactly where all the different sectors are operating that create the conditions where people fall off the cliff. And so we firmly believe at the Trust that homelessness really is a result of multiple systems failing. But our response is not a systemic response. It's a crisis response. So we started to think about that, and we started also to see that maybe about 4 years ago, homelessness overall started to decline. And so we said, that's not what we're hearing from our folks across the country. That's not what we're visually seeing specifically or especially on the coasts. And so why is that? And so we dug into the data. It was so important to disaggregate that data because that tells us the truth. And we saw that in high-cost cities, it was ticking up. We saw that that also demographically, people of color, that number wasn't going down. And we started to ask ourselves why. And we said, well, the high cost of housing. So it's important for us to, really partner in a different way with the housing sector. And then we kept on asking ourselves why. Why is housing so important? Why? We were like kids, why? But the beauty of asking why is it forces us to dig deeper. And we started to think about the impact on health outcomes. We started to think about the impact on education outcomes, how disruptive homelessness is to a child's education, how detrimental homelessness is to people's health and to health outcomes. And in order to advance those outcomes, we really need to focus on safe, stable, affordable housing. I had dinner last night with Nan Roman at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and she was saying that a national study was done, and they did, and it was self-report, but still, out of the 64,000 that they talked to, 32,000 were unsheltered. And of that, half reported that they became homeless as a result of health-related issues. That's not a homeless crisis. That's a public health crisis. There were 76% of the unsheltered population, of the women who were unsheltered, were trimorbid. 76%. Trimorbid means that you have a mental health disorder, a chronic health condition, and a substance use disorder. That's a public health crisis. That's something that the homelessness sector in and of itself can't respond to. And so that's why when in unearthing these things, we said, there's a bigger picture than just the homelessness sector, and we need to partner with other people.
And a similar story for the Gates Foundation. I work for the Pacific Northwest team. So we're the part of the foundation that focuses all of our grant making on Washington State. And it's a relatively small team within the foundation with two major strategies, one focusing on homelessness, family homelessness in the region, the other focusing on education. And when I joined the foundation, these two strategies existed completely in isolation from one another. The homelessness initiative had as our goal and metrics everything related to housing outcomes, nothing to do with educational outcomes for the kids. Our education folks didn't have housing instability or homelessness at all on their radar screen. And it wasn't until we started having conversations both internally as well as externally with some of our partners that we realized that this type of siloing that we frequently would decry outside of our organization existed within our small office within the P&W team at the foundation. And so luckily, in our community, we have some great partners who were doing similar thinking about whether or not they, as housing authorities, were really living up to kind of their full potential without thinking about whether or not the services and housing that they were providing were actually having an impact on the kids who were growing up in that subsidized housing. And at the time, we didn't even have the data available to answer that question. So really kind of through deep conversations with them about the work that they were doing and some thinking on our own end, we were compelled to start thinking about the relationship between these two strategies that existed within our team and our department. And that's what led us on this journey towards thinking about housing and education. And one of the things that I'll just add is that as we also at the same time started going deeper into really, let's name it, talk about racism that exists within our community and the opportunity gaps that we saw both within the educational system as well as in the crisis response system. One of the things that we knew we needed to have a better understanding is how race played out in our thinking about these two systems. And once we had invested in trying to create the data to better understand that, it just leaps off the page as to why you have to think about this work in a cross-sector manner. So one of the things that we were very startled to discover once we had done these data matching analyses is just how many African American kids within the Seattle School District were actually being served by the Housing Authority. What we found out through the data analysis is that about 38% of all African American Seattle School District kids are being served by SHA. We found out that of all, about 10% of all African American students within the district had experienced homelessness over 1 year. So you add those numbers together and you come close to 50% of all African American students within the Seattle School District are suffering from some form of housing instability. The district has announced that it's one of their top priorities to close the opportunity gap. The question then becomes, how can you meaningfully go about doing that without reaching out to the very folks who are providing housing services to those families without having them as a key partner in your work? So it really has been about building the case that you can't achieve any of your goals individually. You have to do them together. Mm-hmm. So my next question really gets to, okay, so through the processes that you just described, you developed a compelling point of view that these housing cross-sector partnerships were important. Can you talk about the grants that you've made, the tools and practices, how you've thought about using your foundation resources to try to foster the type of cross-system partnerships that you've wanted to bring about?
All right, let me try to be succinct here. And from like going way back. So, I mentioned sort of the healthy housing dimension. So we actually launched an initiative about 10 years ago now called Advancing Safe and Healthy Housing, which is really looking at sort of cross-sector approaches to the issue, because we knew that there were like public sector and some nonprofits that were working together. But what we want to do is really emphasize especially policy dimensions or responses to this issue. And so we supported a number of sites around the country to do that kind of work. So that was, and like I say, that led us to some other kinds of revelations as we were going through this work. And, so it led us to sort of think about, especially on the health side, what kind of money was there to sort of help. And a number of things kind of came up, sort of in that. And there was a bunch of things that we began to investigate via a number of grants. So, one was obviously sort of the Medicaid connection to, so let's say, asthma interventions. So that was sort of one stream of work, which, we started a while ago. And then I just mentioned, there was this opportunity in California, Los Angeles, around permanent supportive housing, and the fact that, there was not nearly enough capital to meet the need for the crisis that they're still experiencing there. And we entered into this partnership with the California Community Foundation, and using sort of our investment side, to think about how we could use that form of capital to leverage more dollars into this space. And it was a much more complicated deal than just that suggests, but it was trying to leverage actually the donor advised funds at the California Endowment, which proved to be enormously successful. So we were actually able to raise that capital within a fairly short period of time. But then we ran into the fact that it's a lot more than a capital question. There's a NIMBY issue, and there's a systemic issue about, the issue of enough supportive housing is actually tied to the dimension of enough affordable housing. But what do you do in a city, where the pressures are great? To use Kamara's example, I mean, people are literally being pushed out, into homelessness, or into at least extreme housing insecurity, or just the sheer stress from that, is going to. So flash forward a few years, and so we've just launched one round of this all led us to this conclusion, that there is a profound crisis going on in this country that really is kind of all hands on deck sort of a thing. But it was our view, given the racial dynamics we've heard about, and just the whole racialization of housing in this country, that community actually, not just a sector, people fundamentally needed to be part of whatever solution ensues, because the people closest to the problem really need to be part of that solution. And I'm not saying that just in kind of a way of signaling virtue here. It's that what we were actually seeing is that people in communities were actually coming up with good ideas, but there was not nearly enough support for them. And what they needed was patient capital to really develop those kinds of things. So that's why we've launched this recent round of funding opportunity aimed primarily at communities, because at the end of the day, if they're not in the forefront of these solutions, you're not going to have solutions that are really going to stick. So I mean, and it's very new. We're going to have to figure out as we go along, so what of those places are really surfacing things that could be scaled or replicable or have other lessons for us, broadly speaking. So I just sort of say that because I think it's at some point we have to really address these issues around having people have the power and agency to really build their own solutions.
Terrific. Susan?
So we knew that we needed to not only look upstream, but also expand our connections and our partners. So we purposefully targeted different foundations and kind of e-stalked you guys to figure out what you were doing, what you were funding, and we targeted foundations that were not necessarily housing funders, but found themselves funding housing or housing-related programs because they recognized that housing stability was essential in being able to further the outcomes that they cared about in their populations. And really, we were talking about much of the same population. And so our response was to pull together a group of foundations, and we called it Funders for Housing and Opportunity. There are 12 foundations now. The Gates Foundation and Kresge Foundation are apart, so I've been dating both of them for about 4 years.
Who's winning?
I'm not going to tell. And it's a great group of large national foundations that that focus on various areas: health, education, social justice, economic mobility, and all of us have a commitment to racial equity. And we really wanted to center that in our funding and think about what would our funding look like if we centered racial equity and we funded across these sectors. And so we spent a lot of time talking about that and developing a framework that we felt good about, that reflected all of our values, and how we can fund. And so we felt that we could make the most impact in funding policy advocacy and organizing. Organizing really came in more recently, admittedly, since the change in administration. Narrative change. Really, how can we impact the way that people think about and talk about and deliver housing? How can we change the visions that you have in your head when you hear certain words like homeless, the homeless, which I can't stand that term. It's not a demographic. It is a situation. And then the third area, scaling what works. And so we all fund things that have worked pretty well. And how can we scale those things so that they can be replicated across the country? And then also, how can we fund and support things that we feel are promising and solutions, cross-sector solutions that work in community? And so we've focused on really funding just collaborative efforts. And so that's how we're encouraging collaboration, is to really, in our RFPs and in our invitations, look for those promising collaborations that are thinking about all these areas and that are centering racial equity and constituent voice in the center.
Yeah, and I'll just add on that, I think one of the things that we've observed is that, like personal relationships, frequently relationships aren't necessarily based at first on mutual attraction. So at the risk of embarrassing my housing authority partners, I think it's fair to say that when we started this work, there was more interest on the housing side than from their educational partners about the work that they wanted to do together. That it was more difficult, at least when we started, for our educational partners to kind of see what was in it for them. Why would they want to start dating housers? Do you think that's fair to say? Fair to say. And so despite how charming the housing authorities may have been, maybe they needed some resources to help their educational partners see why this partnership would be a valuable one for them to enter into. And I think there were a couple of ways that we thought our philanthropic resources could be helpful in aiding the situation. The first was the data. As I mentioned earlier, there really wasn't a strong data argument to be made for why the educational sector should partner with the housing authorities. In the absence of data that really could specifically nail down what the overlap was in populations, what particular schools had the highest levels of concentration of kids who were growing up in SHA housing or that were homeless, it's very difficult to make the case as to why this partnership should even matter. So one of the first things that we did was provided resources that could be used to try to enter into some of those data sharing agreements to answer some of those questions so that when the housing authority went to the superintendent of schools to say, here's why this partnership makes sense, you actually had a reason to take that meeting. The second thing I would say is that, the reality is these sectors use different language and have different goals, and frequently folks don't speak those same languages. And so one of the questions that we were confronted with is, how do we try to ensure that at least someone within each of those sectors understood the drives and priorities of the other sector? And I think Michael Mira from the Tacoma Housing Authority was one of the first folks to really bring this to operationalize this when he hired a former deputy superintendent from the Tacoma School District to come and work on his team at the Housing Authority. And so some of the most valuable resources I think that we provided was to allow for that type of cross-hiring. And people joked around that they started poaching each other. And there are good examples of people in this room who have gone from a housing authority to a school district or from a school district to a housing authority. And we view that as being a very positive move, that actually what that does is it embeds within each of those sectors an understanding for how you make arguments that others can relate to. There's a very real language barrier that needs to be overcome. And so by hiring people who speak education to work in housing authorities and vice versa, I think that we saw a lot of impact through that work.
Some people have used the term Sherpa, that we're in a period right now, and Peggy Bailey has been, I think, the first person I heard it from. You know, in this work, we need people who can actually understand these different languages, because it really is different languages. In the hospital sector, we're seeing you probably have heard this, some hospitals trying to build housing, which is a good thing. But I've been in conversations where the things is, what's a tax credit? Yeah, you're laughing, but this is real. And so, I mean, we're at the stage where, there's going to be a lot of education, and we need those kind of people.
Yeah. Speaking of language, I was on a panel last week, and I was with two people who were in the community and speaking for the community. And they said, you guys talk about equity. And in the community, we don't know, that means, equity in your home. We're not on the same level. We don't talk about it in the same way. We use plain language, and I think that's so important in the narrative change work that we're engaging in, and we're trying to figure out what that looks like in our funding collaborative. Working across sectors is going to be a challenge. And so one of the places where we said we wanted to start was with values, because at some level, even if the language is different, can we get to a set of shared values? And then within our sectors, we can message it, with our respective languages. But we really need to start thinking about what are those shared values.
Yeah, and just before we open it up to all of you for questions and answers, just following up on that, I think on the topic of narrative change, I was just having a conversation yesterday with David Williams from Opportunity Insights about the way that the narrative is so much stronger for all of us if we can talk about the way that we're thinking about the work in a cross-sector fashion. And I guess I would say I think that this has been one of the main insights that I've seen come out of the Pacific Northwest, is that unless housing can be seen as a platform for better outcomes for families, housing will continue to just be seen as something that we're doing for the less fortunate, which is not nearly as compelling a message to a broad audience than housing is an essential component to provide people what they need to break the cycle of intergenerational poverty. The real connection between kind of addressing child poverty, upward mobility, all of those issues, depends upon the ability to use housing resources to lead to those better social outcomes. I think one of the things that we were surprised to see in our data sharing was that even though you'd like to be able to say that with housing resources, kids do better than low-income families that don't receive those subsidies, the data actually is not clear on that point. So if you can't actually say that housing resources are making a difference in the educational trajectory of those kids, those dollars are always going to be questioned. So it's important to us to be able to share the cross-systems message to say that housing dollars are an essential, critical component to make the case that with those dollars, we know that we're going to see better outcomes for kids and for families. And so I think in terms of the narrative change, making the stronger case for housing dollars, as well as for all general anti-poverty services, this type of cross-systems thinking is really important to get to. So with that, you all have done an amazing job of hanging with us and staying mostly awake. We've got about 11 minutes left for questions and answers. 12, 15. So who'd like to start us off? Yeah.
Thank you. It's on. So I'm just curious if where your foundation stands in the topic of displacement. Since we talked about housing and housing dollars, I haven't heard the word displacement. So.
Sir?
Well, it really is the focus of our most recent grant funding opportunity, which we call Advancing Health Equity Through Housing. We didn't put the word out quite as explicit, maybe, just because that word has all kinds of different kind of connotations, and people interpret it differently. And if you go into communities, they won't use that word; they'll use gentrification. But that very much is kind of what we're trying to address. Having said that, it's a very complex issue, but we see it as a true public health problem, insofar as it leads to really, housing instability, which is tied to stress in particular, but other things. So it very much is core to how we're thinking about it. We're part of another major funding collaborative called the SPARK, or Strong, Prosperous, and Resilient Communities Challenge, with a number of foundations, including some of them here, that is focused on equitable development in 6 communities. And even though the original focus was on transit-oriented development, in every single one of those communities, what the community is saying is the priority is displacement. So I don't know what the solution is, but that has now become kind of the priority in those places in terms of development. How to develop, without putting people out of their homes.
It's extremely relevant in what we're focused on, homelessness, because that's a driver, is displacement, and people no longer being able to afford their homes, being forced out of their homes, particularly since the housing crisis. Our double-edged sword on how to address it with our partners is we are advocating for housing affordability. Along with housing affordability, part and parcel, an unintended consequence is gentrification and displacement. When we invest in communities and build communities from the inside out, and so we agree that the mobility is both and, that we are encouraging mobility to high opportunity neighborhoods, but also encouraging investment in low-income neighborhoods where people are, where affordable housing is. But that double-edged sword also is then, how do you make it affordable, make it an area that's thriving and where low-income households can connect to opportunity in their area without attracting higher income people who will price them out of their homes. So we haven't figured that out. If you have, that would be great. You can tell us.
Yeah. We can talk after. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, but that's our double-edged sword.
So, Kollin. Hi there. I don't know if they have a TV show where they take the participants in a dating game and 5 years later they look at the results of the relationship. But he left me for another housing. He left me for another school district. And the reality is we have 3 school districts that we've been partnering with deeply. And over the 5 years, I think we've had 10 different superintendents cycle through those school districts. And part of the challenge is, how do we create enduring institutional partnerships? Much of what I think the progress we've made has been made through chemistry with individual leaders. And the challenge is, how do you get beyond that? How do you get beyond the foundation support, which is always fleeting, to create long-term structural incentives for these kind of partnerships? You'd like to think that recognition that the synergy is beneficial to both would be enough, but it rarely is. And we've looked at things such as putting into federal grants bonus points that get embedded in there on an ongoing basis. We've now got a superintendent on our Housing Authority Board of Commissioners, but that's not mandated by the state, unlike, for example, having a labor leader on the board. And I'm curious from the 3 of you, what you think the best long-term strategies are for really creating solid institutional relationships that are not dependent upon individual relationships or temporary funding from a foundation to create a partnership?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually think that this may not answer your question perfectly, but I think no matter what the issue, we're at this era right now where we have to create whole new kinds of governance structures that span different sectors. Like, health and housing, or education and housing. I think all three of them actually should get together, which means like creating the kinds of tables where people make commitments, and that we find ways that connect data, because part of the issue is how do we connect data between any sector, whether it's housing and education or health and housing. One interesting thing on the education front, we funded an effort in Lehigh Valley with a hospital, because they were they had created all these school-based health centers. But the students, there was this high rate of, and I think this was the issue you guys were finding out, was a high rate of transience. And so they would go from place to place and they could not track the students. This is kind of pre-ACA, and so they created a common database that went across 3 school districts, all the health systems. And to do that, they really had to create that infrastructure on the data sharing, on the policies, in terms of the students, in terms of how the treatment. So, I've seen it done, but it really requires people's willingness to create whole new structures, that can also then be tied by funding. And I think what health systems are trying to do is use different kinds of mechanisms like accountable health, et cetera, to provide the sort of funding for those kinds of things.
I agree. Creating that structure and creating that table that you talked about. And an example I can give, when I was working in Atlanta, I was working on a citywide, and it was really a city and county wide initiative for homelessness for the mayor's office. And was very concerned about the sustainability of the work that we were doing. And so what I didn't want was a mayor's blue ribbon commission to help with this. And so instead had an advisory board that was comprised of, as David said, people who had the decision-making authority, either over people or over budget. And from different areas and sectors across the city. So we had from state government, county government, philanthropy, corporate, and so that mix of people and decision makers was able to be sustained even until now. So what we ended up doing was creating a 501c3, and then just imported those people onto the board. And that organization is still going, and now Atlanta has recommitted $50 million public-private funding for homelessness, and now that entity is the holder of those, and the administrator of those funds. So as an example. Mm-hmm.
And I guess, you've hit it right on, Stephen. That's the most challenging question, I think, for all of us as funders, is the long-term sustainability. And I guess I keep going back to and thinking about your question that ultimately philanthropic dollars have to my mind, morph into public dollars. That's the only sector that's going to be able to continue this at scale. And so I think part of our aspiration in seeding the work is to, through developing the best data systems that exist, to kind of prove out the value proposition of the work moving forward by supporting narrative change and advocacy efforts that, in some way that we can build the case for ultimately a public funding source that can continue to support that, because resources are always going to be scarce on the core missions, no matter what sector you're from, and additional dollars will be necessary to try to build that. So it's not an easy answer by any stretch, but I think that ultimately paths lead towards local, state, and federal funding sources. I don't think I have. The other thing that I would say is that I think in terms of the way that we can build the structures to try to keep things going beyond the personal chemistry that one might have is to try to seed it at multiple levels within the organization. So while there's turnover at all levels, what we've tried to do is to try to create opportunities for those connections to be made at the superintendent ED level, as well as at the kind of staff level, as well as on the ground, so that even when those changes occur, if things aren't clicking on all cylinders with one level of the relationship, maybe there's enough sustainability on other levels to keep the wheels moving.
Yes, there's been like a push for scalability, and every state, city, neighborhood has different nuances. What are some of the best examples or practices that you've seen that make a scalable model?
You want to take that, Dave?
There was this big announcement by, was it Gates? I forget now, in Seattle for housing and Microsoft, that's it. And then knew there was a connection, and in the Bay Area, and for basically new capital. And I've come to the conclusion that while we certainly need to build more, in terms of scalability, and we know different ways of doing that, and there's some emerging things. I think it has to be a policy solution, because if we don't recognize this, that there is a scarce amount of real estate, especially in some of the high pressure cities, but just in general, to house people, with more people moving to cities. So there's got to be a policy solution that recognizes this as a problem and prioritizes it. So I'll say that, and I think there's some examples around the country that have been doing some things. In Colorado, some interesting things around ADUs, additional dwelling units, and then in LA, there's a thing on rapid transit where there's a policy around developers having to have so much affordable units around, TODs, T-stops, things like that. I think are promising. So I just sort of say that, but I also think that, get back to my original point that, and there's all kinds of things around rent protections that I think are important, but I think even despite all of those things, there really almost needs to be a major, and this is why we're focusing so much on narrative change, just a major shift in how we talk about housing in this country. Because without it, I just don't know how we get to a truly scalable solution.
Mm-hmm. I have an example from homelessness, but hopefully we can see the connections. Using data, people were able to prove the effectiveness of housing on health and in the health system, and the cost effectiveness of housing. And we were able to prove with data the impact of permanent supportive housing. And that caught a wave across the country. It caught a wave with state support, state-supported subsidies. It caught a wave through federal funding. And it was that evidence that showed that this works and these set of conditions work, that was able to take that to scale. So I would say, in your local jurisdiction, the things that you're working on that you would like to scale, use the data, use the evidence to be able to socialize that and get the support that you need.
And I would just add, I think it's our hope that, the past 2 days are kind of a tool towards scaling, that what you've heard today and yesterday are examples of things that are going on in different local communities that can be brought to other places, and Funders for Housing and Opportunity is meant to try to, one of the topic areas, as Susan mentioned, is this idea of, can we provide philanthropic resources to scale and to bring solutions that seem to be having some promise in one part of the country to others. So for example, House Ed, which I know that there was a session on. Jennifer Peck is here from Partnership for Children and Youth. That was a program that deliberately brought together folks from the after-school sector to the housing sector and started working together in the Bay Area. They've now been very successful in kickstarting an effort in the Pacific Northwest to try to bring that model to another part of the country. In some ways this goes back to Stephen's question earlier. CMTO, another good example of a common research base that in the Pacific Northwest we were able to pick up and run with, and now there's federal appropriation for those types of efforts moving in other parts of the country. So I think of scale and sustainability as really being kind of the same thing. And I think all of this, and really the value of this conference, has been trying to build the movement to ensure that all of this work can be brought to scale and can continue to be sustained. So do we have time, or should we? So one more question.
This is a kind of broad question, and I want to set this in the context of you guys as philanthropists kind of get to see a lot of really cool solutions that hopefully will kind of save us all in the end, working together. And relative to housing, we've all been fighting the battle of affordable housing for years. The numbers of public housing units have come down. There have been alternative plans, RAD and some other things to develop housing and all that kind of stuff. But the population's increased, the number of public housing units proportionally has not even increased that much. At the same time, the population's aging. The number of folks with defined benefit retirement plans is few even had defined contribution retirement plans of any kind. And Susan talked about falling off the cliff. And as our numbers of baby boomers are aging, myself included, 202 money for elderly housing going down. I guess I'm wondering, are you seeing any solutions to make sure that all those folks don't fall off the cliff, because the numbers just seem astronomical, and not to mention the fact that the housing stock, and everybody wants to stay in their home and home-based healthcare and that kind of stuff, but we've got a suburban model that does not sustain very well for folks who at some point can't drive anymore, would like to be able to just walk and see friends or get to a store and that kind of thing. So I'm just curious if there's any kind of long-term visioning plan out there to address it. We've posed the question in the past to folks at HUD and other organizations, and they're frustrated, and some of it's a planning question, a resource question, a will question, and I don't want to deal with it question. So I'm just wondering if you're seeing anything and have any ideas or any models or anything that we can look to or work to.
Okay, so a nice upbeat softball to close down the to close down the session. Anyone want to take a crack at that?
I wish I could say yes, but I can't. There has been a lot of discussion going back, starting a few years ago, about what we're going to do with the aging baby boomer population, and I don't think that people outside of the housing sector, outside of the social services sector, even within, really understand the magnitude of the issue that we're facing. And so there's been discussion. The Bipartisan Policy Center pulled together a group headed by Secretary Cisneros to try to figure out solutions. AARP, other organizations have been talking about this and have put out briefs, but no one has come up with the cry that we need to move now. So it's a very relevant issue, and we have not moved fast enough to address it.
Yeah. The BPC piece is actually, I think, a useful framework because because they also talk about the fact that in terms of long-term supports and services, we're not nearly ready, and like who is going to even staff them, especially if we keep immigrants out of the country. But so that actually is a framework, but I'm not, to Susan's point, I haven't seen anybody say, yeah, we've got to do this, because it really involves a strong federal response at this point. And it's going to be hard to get there without it.
So with that, thank you.